From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. The UK is facing the greatest threat to our security in a generation.
I've never seen a situation like this in my 40 years of service. It's really coming to a point where I must say we have to be prepared to be ready to defend ourselves, to show Russia that it's not easy to have an attack against NATO territory.
Suddenly we were not able to assume that a confrontation with Russia might not be until the early 2030s. It might be in 2025.
They're at war with us now. Vladimir Putin has made it absolutely clear that he's at war with us.
The front line, if you like, is here. The threat we now face is more serious, more immediate, and more unpredictable than at any time since the Cold War.
The Prime Minister says we have to be ready for war.
We are moving to war-fighting readiness. When we are being directly threatened by states with advanced military forces, the most effective way to deter them is to be ready.
But are we ready?
Because we know all three services face very serious challenges. Hollowed out forces, procurement waste, low morale.
This week, the government unveiled the Strategic Defence Review. Its plan to modernise the armed forces to meet the urgent threats we face. But will it work? We hear from the general who helped to write it. What will the wars of the future look like? Are robots and drones the answer? And does the government need to spend more and sooner to protect us? The story today: is Britain ready for war?
My full name is General Sir Richard Barrons. Although I handed over my last role in uniform in 2016, I've just finished a 9-month period as one of the 3 leaders of this government's Strategic Defence Review.
You've spent months working on this. You were initially set the task of trying to work out what our defence should look like at a time when the world was actually quite different, last summer. A lot's changed since then. Donald Trump has come in. We're no longer certain we can rely on America to defend us. Do you feel confident that your review still matches those challenges?
When we set out in July last year, we were asked 2 questions. What do you need to do to make defence fit for the world we live in? And what do you get for this money? And for this money in July last year was you might get 2.5% of GDP by 2029, 2030. And then we were essentially forbidden from breathing any thoughts of ever any more money because things are tight.
That's interesting. So they're trying to work out the best form of defence, but within the limits of a very, very tight budget.
It seemed to us that the world then changed remarkably in February this year. And amongst ourselves, we called this the February pivot. And what we saw was, first of all, the current US administration saying what US administrations had been saying for more than 20 years.
But this time meaning it.
But this time with perhaps a greater sense of urgency. And they're saying, look, it is not acceptable for the US taxpayer to subsidise quite so generously the defence and security of 500 million quite wealthy Europeans, principally against their awkward neighbour, 140 million not so wealthy Russians. That made sense in 1949, but it's out of balance. What we saw in February was a very clear exposition of this at the Munich Security Conference, and a sense that there might be a cliff edge, that drop in support might be dramatic. And of course, a cliff edge is more than expensive, it's actually dangerous. Actually, so far, frankly, very little has changed. But the uncertainty is there. The second thing that really mattered was this sense of Mr. Trump and his administration reaching for a relationship with Russia over the heads of Europe. And that added a certain amount of disquiet to that uncertainty about the pace and scale of a US reduction in security support. But there was this sense, in July of last year that it might take Russia some years to recover the wherewithal in order to pose a military threat to bits of NATO. But on the basis of that pivot in February, suddenly we were not able to assume that a confrontation with Russia might not be until the early 2030s. It might be in 2025, particularly if there was a rapid peace settlement. So that changed the game. And with that came the government's bold decision to change the financial question that was set for us, which is, what do you need to do to UK defence for the world we live in, and what do you get for 2.5% of GDP in 27-28, starting on the 1st of April 2027, so we're clear, rising to 3% by no later than 2034. And our recommendations, more than 60, are affordable within that profile.
We're going to talk about that review in some depth in a moment. Before we do, though, what you're basically saying is from February, from this pivotal moment, you realise that you may not have the same American support that so much of our defence has been built on. You know, a lot of our kit is made to fit in with theirs in the assumption that they'll be there with us. And Russia is potentially more dangerous and more likely to launch some sort of attack much sooner than we'd anticipated. Given that, even now, with this defence review you've put forward, 3% by 2034 is not enough if we think Russia might be invading by 2025.
So I think the jury is still out. And I'm going to argue that the direction of travel that we've set out in the review, I get into trouble for saying this and I have to explain it, but we have charted the most profound transformation of UK defence for 150 years. So it's good for all outcomes. You've still got to do it, and you might want to get on with it. However, in answering the Russian question, the fact is there's still a lot of US support to European security. Not a whole lot have changed. It's the uncertainty. But that uncertainty has had the same effect on our European partners. So the German Chief of Defence, an admirable man, has been told, don't worry too much about your budget. You need to spend money now. So we need to recognise the answer for the UK is found in collective security arrangements, of which NATO is the key element. But this question mark is still there as to whether in the world we live in, the plan that we have set out needs to go faster. And this is beyond the scope of the review, and I am only now at liberty to talk like this because
but in your personal opinion, beyond the scope of the review, do we need to do more faster?
Well, I'm a lifelong military person, and I will always argue that based on the risks I see, you would do better to spend more money on defence and security. And our history, if you go back, to the First and Second World War, is, and this is a very human thing, is people like me will make a case for acting rationally sooner to do better. But that comes at the cost of things that people want more. They want more NHS. They want more social protection. They're less worried by defence because they don't feel the fear until they feel the fear. But if you live in a new era of state confrontation, and that new era presents potentially existential risks to the safety and security and prosperity of this country, this is a different world. Now, if you're in that world, you do need to think differently, and it's not in the habit of citizens, of government, of institutions, not even in the habit really of the armed forces, to be honest.
So we may have to do more and faster than we're talking about today. But going on to the defence review that you've set out, we've already touched on a little bit of the threat we face. Keir Starmer launched it saying, we are now a country that needs to be war ready. For a lot of people here, war still feels like a very distant idea. Just tell us why you, as somebody who watches this all the time, feels that there is a threat, and it is quite imminent. What would that threat look like? What should we be most worried about?
So I absolutely agree that most of the citizens of this country are in a very happy place where they get up every day and they're not worried about their security. Should they be? They should be worried a bit more, and I'm going to try and explain why. So the first reason is Russia thinks it's at war with the West, and it thinks the UK is second only to the US in being the source of aggressive intent towards Russia. And war is one of those things where you may not want to engage in it, but it can choose you. You only need one to start the dance, and Russia has started that dance. But Russia is somewhere away and quite preoccupied in Ukraine, and people say, yes, but how does that affect me? Well, the first thing to say is not only are we confronting a new level of risk in this world, because of the digital age, this risk is presented in very different ways. And below the threshold of military conflict every single day.
Short of an actual invasion, we might still be attacked by them in different ways.
So the very last thing we're worried about is an invasion by the Russian ground forces of the UK. There's an awful lot of Europe to get through to get here. But war isn't really only about territory. War is a battle of will. And if you want to break the UK's will to resist, you can affect that in ways that involve not just no boots on the ground, but no military weapons, because this will occur in targeting our daily national life. And people will have seen in the media Russian and other activity to try and cut the cables that carry the internet. Those cables are vital to our economy, to the city, to our daily lives. If your email goes to and from America, it goes down one of those cables. It can't go through space. Most of our energy arrives in pipelines, so 40% of the gas from Norway. 95% of the things we use and the majority of our food comes by sea. And every one of us that has a smartphone is attached to a satellite because that's how the GPS system works. We use this technology every single day. So if you want to break the will of the UK, you don't have to resort to conventional or even digital age military technology, which we'll come to. You just tackle daily life below the military threshold, and that's cyber attack, that's disruption.
I mean, just describe sort of the net effect of those different things. What would an ordinary person's life, how much would it change?
So if you ask someone like me, and I think I'm really good at this, to bring the daily life of someone we don't get on with to a halt, what would I do? I would target the power, the water, the telecom systems, the traffic systems. If I'm being really difficult, I target the tax base. I'd erode the tax records. So, you cast bits of civilization constructed over 100 years back to a zero start. So people would wake up and all the things they depend on, which are attached to the digital infrastructure, don't work. There's no power, there's no water, there's no food in the supermarkets because the distribution chains are broken. Their mobile phones don't work, the banks don't work. And also, I do two other things. One is in their social media, I'm telling them this only gets worse and it's not going to get any better unless you agree with me. And I'm then going to try and do some physical things, like turn the power off, and then tell everybody through their smartphone that they're next, and it'll get worse. The historical evidence of that, if you take, for example, Sarajevo way back in the 1990s, a thriving city, 2 weeks later, everyone's living a feral existence where they're going out to look for water with a bucket. So I am in no way suggesting this is imminent. I am no way suggesting even that it's likely. What I am saying is in the world we live in, those vulnerabilities exist. And that is before we cross into the military threshold. So if you look at what's happened in Ukraine and what's happened to cities like Kyiv, they are immensely vulnerable to air attack, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and armed drones. And yet Kyiv is the best defended European city from air attack, but it's still facing an onslaught and its power infrastructure has been targeted and it's taking casualties every week. That sort of military capability, ballistic and cruise missiles in particular, is the same capability that, if it came to it, would arrive over London and Liverpool and Birmingham and do the same sort of harm. That's what war in the 21st century looks like. So none of that is a good place to be. And the answer is you have to do two things. And the review gets into this space. The first is you need to reset deterrence. And deterrence is a combination of resilience at home, being able to absorb a blow. So citizens who know if the water doesn't come out of the tap, it's not actually the end of the world. We need citizens who are resilient to a bad day.
We're not quite there yet.
No, and indeed the 35 years of the post-Cold War era has had the joy of developing citizens who have not had to think like that, to the point where many people think that they are entitled to a life that's safe and prosperous. And if something goes wrong, it is the government's job to fix it. Well, in the world, very dystopian world that we're talking about, there isn't an immunity. And there isn't an entitlement, and the government can't fix it. Everyone has to play a part. Now, the Prime Minister, when he changed the money for defence in February, talked about, and he did this again this week, a whole-of-society undertaking. That's what we're talking about.
Every part of society, every citizen of this country has a role to play. Because we have to recognise that things have changed. In the world of today, The front line, if you like, is here. The threat we now face is more serious, more immediate, and more unpredictable than at any time since the Cold War.
In this era of risk, the armed forces will do their thing, but everyone else has a part to play, and we need to begin to redefine that.
Richard, we've had you on the podcast in the past talking about the wars of the future, the robot wars that we can all expect to see. And we'll put a link to that in the description of this podcast so people can still go back and have a listen. But that's clearly the sort of vision that you've brought to this defence review. So just give us an idea now of what you think a battle in, say, 5 or 10 years' time would look like, and what you've done in this defence review to try and change the way we would fight it.
So first of all, we recognise that war can come in many forms, and the war that most people think about is a war for territory, like you see in Ukraine. So actually the thing that's not going to change is if you're having a battle over land, it's going to be dominated by firepower. And in Ukraine, it's a combination of essentially artillery and aircraft and drones. And if you're in that environment, you are still going to dig trenches, and you're still going to very much want an armoured vehicle to move about in so that you can do it safely. And you're going to fight for the control of territory, and that becomes an infantry tussle. And the point I'm making is, in this new world, the orchestra of war changes all the time, but you don't throw away the entire wind section because you bought an organ. You know, the whole thing is constantly evolving. So the first thing we are saying about war in our time is it is war. It's the same brutal thing that's gone on throughout human history. So start there. Secondly, there are some things that stay the same. You're still going to need people who are prepared to fight at a very elemental level. But then technology is changing. And in the review, there are probably 2 major constituent parts to that. The first is essentially, in a network world, every sensor, so whether it's a satellite, a ship, an aeroplane, down to a smartphone or open source data, you can connect all of that in one network to a database managed by AI, overseen by humans. And that database can be connected also to any weapon system, whether that's a tank, an aircraft, a ship, a submarine, or even a different response like a tweet. And in the jargon, this digital targeting network, which some will call a kill web.
A kill web.
A kill web. We don't use those words. We're using digital targeting network, but that's the jargon.
That sounds more sanitary, but what exactly is that?
Okay, so it connects any sensor to any weapon system. And you can see these at work every day in Ukraine and in places like Gaza. And it's important to understand what that means in terms of speed of response and scale. So in somewhere like Gaza, which is a terrible place to be, but it's very small in military terms, from typically a drone seeing something and communicating that something to a database, that database assisted by AI identifying what that something is, determining that it's a target you want to fire at, and passing that target location to the most appropriate weapon system, which could be a tank or it could be a missile or a drone. And that weapon firing, that happens in 7 seconds.
7 seconds.
And the machine, because it is a machine, just keeps doing that. It can do it hundreds of times a day. But that's in a very small space. In Ukraine, the same effect is generally around 2 minutes. So if you are seen by a Russian drone and you're driving along in your armoured vehicle, you very badly want to be somewhere else within 2 minutes, because either a drone will be firing at you or the artillery or something will be firing at you. But what we need to conceive of as this century unfolds through the next couple of decades is big powers, and I really mean the US and China. They will build global, and I'm going to use this expression, kill webs, with global range, because range is only a function of being able to see the target, fuel and navigation. And so we may be quite focused on a Russian challenge to Europe now, but as you go through this century, the benchmark technology in our world is likely to be set by China, because a quarter of all the R&D people on the planet are in China. And so that means countries like China would be capable of seeing a target in and around the UK and striking it from in and around China. And we'll all be in that. We'll all be in that place. It will all be in that place. So that's a world that's already transparent from space, connected to precision weapons with global range, and they would be primarily conventional weapons. So the digital age is having this astonishingly profound effect on how you think about doing war. And the bit that the review majors on, Army, Navy and Air Force, you think about, let's take the Navy, as people on ships and submarines. And the future is you'll have some people on ships and in submarines, but they will be a diminishing percentage of a Navy which has uncrewed ships and aeroplanes and submarines.
So hang on, these are whole ships that are being run from afar by remote control, effectively.
So a remote control ship is only moderately exciting because you can do that now. They already exist now. I mean, you can, even if you take a big container ship.
You don't need a single person on it.
Well, actually, you do need somebody on it because someone's got to oil the things that need oiling. But the driving can be done from anywhere on the planet. Just in the way there's a strategic protector drone, such as the US have. It may be over a target somewhere in the Asia. It's been flown from the US, and the UK would be the same.
Richard, you explained how you've gone about this really transformational review of our defences, but within a very tight budget. How much of this review is governed by politics? And I ask that because I think a lot of people will have seen it being launched in Scotland, where there's a by-election in the offing, talking about 12 submarines being built in shipyards around there, which will keep them busy. Do we really need 12 submarines? Is that the best use of our budget?
What I think has been really good is that with a lot of help, we wrote our review, we established what our recommendations would be, and then we put them to government, and they had to think, and we had some stiff discussions, and what they have announced are our recommendations, and that, there was a bit of give and take in there. So first of all, we have a submarine-based deterrent. It's vital. It's the thing that Mr. Putin acknowledges most when he thinks about the UK. And that deterrent works because it's protected. So you need nuclear submarines to protect the deterrent. But if one of the things you're keen to do is to keep Russian maritime capability away from cables and pipelines that serves not just the UK but our NATO allies, you're going to need submarines. And you're going to need submarines that are stealthy and can stay at sea for a really long time. And then you're going to need submarines that could basically go anywhere, obviously underwater, in the world with a cruise missile and fire it safely, both in terms of firing it and it hitting the target it's meant to hit. These submarines are expensive, and you're going to make one every 18 months. But they are also tremendous value and a great deterrent. And in the context of big water like the Pacific, these submarines are really effective because you can't see a submarine from space. You can find a ship from space. So this is an illustration where in a high-low mix of capability, you're going to spend some of your money on these really expensive platforms because they give you an edge that you need that you can't get any other way. And what you're now going to do in this new high-low world is you're going to augment them with things that are cheaper and you care less about. And the mix will constantly evolve, and it's the mix that makes you competitive.
These new submarines, though, won't be available to us until late 2030s at the earliest, knowing the way these things work out, probably 2040s. In the meantime, we've talked about this before. Quantum sensing is already a thing. Quantum computing is moving so quickly, and it is basically going to mean that within decades, everything under the ocean is visible. That will make these submarines visible quite soon into their lifetime. Is that really a good use of our money?
So that point is not proven yet. There's still an awful lot of sea. So I think everybody accepts the potential of quantum sensing to make the seas transparent. But it's nowhere near happening yet. And there's still a lot of sea. So
but
we're in
neither
transition.
are the submarines. They're not coming in for more than a decade.
There's a plan, but they get made every 18 months. So my view would be proceed on this plan for now and keep checking it. Don't build these submarines if they become redundant. And military technology changes all the time. So this moment is more likely to come than not. So having a plan to build up to 12 will, of course, be regulated by the fact that when you get to wherever it is, 8, 9, 10, 12, the world hasn't changed.
You were asked to deliver this defence review, as you say, to a very tight budget, to sort of an ambition of 3% by 2034. We now know that in 3 weeks' time, NATO is meeting and is likely to agree that the new baseline for membership will be 3.5%. Is the government, I mean, you've been in intense conversations with them, are they ready to accept that? Are they ready to step up to the plate?
So I don't work for the government, and I'm not part of them, and I've watched them agonise over the very bold decisions they took in February. So one thing I'm sure about, this is really, really difficult. I also think it's fair to say that only the UK provides an European independent nuclear deterrent declared to NATO. So could we please have some prizes for that?
France has nuclear weapons and is already committed to 3.5% in the last couple of days.
It doesn't commit its deterrent to NATO. It might. I'd also say that the UK armed forces, in many respects, are different and have an edge other countries don't have. Having said all of that, if the consensus of our allies is that to do deterrence as an alliance effectively, you have to step up with more money, and they're clear what that money would be spent on, then my view as a leading NATO player is that the UK will feel obliged to conform. But let's be really clear, in the current fiscal circumstances, if people raise that, they then need to say what it is they don't want in terms of bits of the welfare state, because that's the only place the money is going to come from.
If we don't have that difficult conversation, if we don't commit to 3.5% by 2030, really, sooner than 2034, we could end up effectively being, the soft underbelly of NATO rather than leading it, because you do have already Eastern European countries committing to almost 5%. You've got France, Germany very much upping the stakes. We end up looking like we're actually a pretty weak link. And that affects the amount of influence we have in those conversations.
So I think that's absolutely so. And if you ask someone like me, the answer is obvious. But if you ask the Chancellor and most citizens of this country, it's less obvious.
If this is your chance to speak to the Chancellor and the citizens of this country, why is it so urgent? Why should we be committing to more?
If you ask someone like me, I'm going to say two things. One is we're going to have to keep in step of an alliance that you claim to be a leading element of, because that's in our own national interest. But I'm also going to say, and I'm an outlier here, is I accept that in saying you should spend, let's say, 3.5% of GDP, I absolutely accept that means that we're going to find a way of trimming in the welfare state, and I realise how painful those trades are. I see very few people agreeing with me in the street on that proposition.
We all know the first duty of a government is to defend the nation, it's to protect us.
Yeah.
If it was up to you, how soon should we be spending more? What should we actually be spending and by when?
So if it was up to me, I would spend 2.5% now, because waiting for 2 years means some holes don't get filled in.
Will that mean real-term cuts if
it means more money from somewhere. So a percent of GDP for defence is very roughly £18 billion. So we're probably talking about finding another £5 billion a year. And bear in mind, they found extra £5 billion this year. So there are either cuts, which I don't think many people would support, or it's more borrowing, which will add to the cost of borrowing. But I would get going faster, and I would hit 3% by the end of this Parliament.
So 2.5% immediately, 3% by the end of this Parliament.
Yeah.
And 3.5%?
My view is if you move earlier and you hit 3%, you probably don't even have to get there, because you'll have hit the spot. You'll have hit the spot of deterrence. Waiting a long time and having an arbitrary figure of GDP might mean you'd spend a lot of money really badly. So there is a prize about going early and well, is that you don't have to spend more.
And if you're trying to translate this to the man or woman on the street, if you're trying to explain the urgency of this, you think we should get to 3% by the end of this Parliament. We're being told there's an ambition for 3% by 2034 at the moment. In the discrepancy between the two, that slightly lost decade, you have children. Do you feel like this country will be safe? How much of a risk is this? How much should we be worried about it?
So we'd be safer, but of course I'm going to argue, being the sort of person that I am, spend more money better and sooner, and bring your allies with you, and the degree of assurance you have in the ability to deter a war you never want to fight will be greater, and that when you do that, it will have cost you more money and you'll have made some hard choices. It'll still be at the margins of UK public spending. But it seems to me much more likely that we will not move at the speed that people like me would argue for because it's too difficult, and then we'll move at the speed of fear.
That was General Sir Richard Barrons, one of the authors of the government's Strategic Defence Review. There's more coverage and analysis online at thetimes.com with a subscription. The producer today was Edward Drummond. The executive producer was Molly Guinness. Sound design was by Hannah Farrell, and theme composition was by Mal Lassetto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to get in touch, do drop us a line at thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.